for Jesus having given his life away in love for us and as an example of how we might live. We also pray that we might have grace to receive those gifts and to be empowered by them to follow in his footsteps. I don't think that's a very tall order on God's side, but it sounds like a tall order for my life, maybe for yours. Receiving the gifts of God and following with them in Jesus' footsteps. Our passages from Isaiah and our psalm today speak of the God-given possibility of that. Receiving the gifts of God and following. Isaiah tells us that God will gather all who make themselves servants of the Lord into the Lord's temple on Israel's holy mountain as one people, a holy people. That's a big promise. And all we have to do is glance around these days and see just how difficult it is to gather all God's people into one holy family of God. We don't even agree on what that would look like. So many groups of us see ourselves as the family of God, or at least the right branch of the best, or the best branch of God's family. And even among our personal families, we may not talk to each other about significant issues anymore. It's just too inflammatory. The divisions among the varieties of Christianity mean that we rarely worship or pray together beyond our group's boundaries. And even churches that have split off from a previous tradition may well split again in a few decades. We've become kind of proud of our divisions sometimes. I was struck by that last weekend, for example. You know, I like being an Episcopalian, and I like being a priest. But I did notice how my black shirt and clergy collar stood out last weekend when I attended the memorial of my daughter-in-law's father, who worked for his whole adult life for the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. That family is very loving, and they love me. And everyone at that memorial gathering welcomed me. They were genuine. There was nothing not to like about that church and those people. But I would feel just a little bit in exile if I were there all the time. And so I have to ask myself, do we need so many parts of our lives tailor-made just to suit us? These days it seems many folks think what matters most about us is our opinion on everything. It's not even just about politics and football anymore. It's reading lists and TV stations and what kind of cars we drive and why we drive them and the food we eat and we don't eat, things we drink and don't drink. It's what clothes and shoes and headgear we wear. It's our tattoos, pro or con, or what color or what kind. It's how we cut our hair or don't cut our hair, what color we may dye it with or not. It's which schools our children go to or not, and why. It's even signs in our front yards and verbal attacks in public places. And I would say, much of it, consciously or not, is about what kind of God we worship. A broad-armed, loving one, or a stingy, wrathful one. Sometimes opinion seems to matter so much that individuals have become their own gods. It's just them who can be good enough for themselves, and they are answerable to nobody else. So if your opinion doesn't agree with mine, then why should I hang around with you, get to know you, walk with you a little ways? I can draw a boundary around myself so that your opinions, your knowledge, your preference, doesn't affect me at all. After all, I certainly don't want to change my behavior just for you. Well, it does get a little claustrophobic within this tight boundary between me and the rest of the world and its peoples. It's a little bit like living inside a medieval fort, the kind with the drawbridge that you see on the Italian hills. Yes, it offers some good protection, especially if it's built high enough. But if the siege lasts long enough, people inside that enclosure can be starved out, burned out, or killed by contagious disease, the kind that strikes us in hours. If others can't get in, that means we can't get out. Maybe Jesus can show us how not to be trapped and smothered by too small, too exclusive boundaries. As today's gospel reading opens, the Pharisees have walked about 80 miles north from Jerusalem to Gennesaret on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, not far from Jesus' home in Capernaum. And by the time the Pharisees have arrived, Jesus has already healed a crowd of sick people, fed 5,000 men plus women and children, and had 12 baskets of bread and fish left over. And then after praying up on the mountaintop, he has appeared walking on water as he goes toward the disciples in the boat, who are being scared because they are being whipped about by a storm on the Sea of Galilee. At Peter's request, Jesus does command him to walk on water too, and Peter was doing that when he noticed that strong wind and the waves, and he got scared, and he began to sink. And then he cries out for Jesus' help, which of course Jesus gives him. But then Jesus asked Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Jesus and Peter get into the boat with the other disciples, and the wind ceases. But as soon as they reach Gennesaret, the town to which they're going, folks in that region from all over have brought their sick for Jesus to heal. You would think that a couple of days like that would have given Jesus plenty of credibility, but the Pharisees show up, and they're asking Jesus, why doesn't he require his disciples to wash their hands before eating? That's what they thought was right. That's what priests have to do in the temple, and they thought everybody should behave like a priest. It wasn't a concern for cleanliness. It was their attempt to hold the disciples accountable for that temple's ritual practice, although Scripture didn't call for it. And Jesus replies to them that purity or defilement originates in the heart and comes out of the mouth. It's not what we eat or whether our hands are clean. The real controversy behind all this is, which one reveals God's will, Jesus or the Pharisees? And we create that same kind of controversy each time we pit ourselves against each other, as if every personal preference were a heaven or hell distinction. So now Jesus, after doing all that, leaves Galilee and heads northwest on the Mediterranean coast toward Tyre and Sidon. Those are Gentile cities. And at least 5 Old Testament prophets had rebuked those cities for their extravagant wealth. Who knows what Jesus is going to say to them? Maybe he thinks some justice needs to happen. So he reaches the borderland, so to speak, between Galilee to the south and east and Gentile territory up here in the north and west along the Mediterranean Sea. And that's when the Canaanite woman comes out of nowhere and starts shouting at Jesus, as if she didn't want to get any closer to him than he wanted to get to her. Remember the name of the land that God gave to the Israelites for them to claim after they escaped from Egypt and lived 40 years in the wilderness. Remember the name of the land they were promised? Yep, it was the land of Canaan. And the Hebrews did conquer Canaan. That means that all the Canaanites ever since and the Israelites ever since had been enemies. And this Canaanite mother is desperate, though. She wants her daughter to be healed. So she doesn't care. The Canaanites and the Israelites have been opponents forever. She shouts at Jesus from a distance and asks for his mercy to grant her daughter the freedom from that demon that torments her. Jesus doesn't say anything. I guess if you're on the border of a foreign land where you're not wanted, a woman of hostile ethnicity shouts at you, the most polite way to respond is just say nothing. And that's what he did. Of course, Jesus' disciples weren't quite that polite. They told Jesus to stop the woman shouting and send her away. So Jesus begins to clarify the boundary between his call and her need. Basically, he doesn't feel called to care for the Canaanites. He feels called to care for the Israelite people, God's claimed people. But the Canaanite woman is desperate. So she draws near to Jesus for the first time and kneels down before him. Lord, sir, help me, she pleads. Jesus still resists. He thinks the Israelites are the ones who need to benefit from his ministry. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, he says. It's a firm boundary around him and what he offers. Yes, Lord, she replies, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus is bowled over. That boundary is broken. Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish, he says. And it was. In that moment, the wall between those historical enemies, between the one who needs healing and the one who gives it, between ritual holiness and the generous healing love of God, is demolished. Which brings the question back to us. What does the holiness of God's people look like for us now in our secular, pluralistic, and much divided world? How do we take down the fortress walls that imprison us and endanger us as much as they protect and define us? Woman, great is your faith, Jesus says. The Canaanite woman who hung on to her desire for her daughter's healing is the one Jesus says has great faith. Great faith. In contrast, Jesus had told impulsive Peter, who asked to walk on the water and was already walking on the water toward Jesus, who got scared and began to sink, that he is a person of little faith. This is Peter, the most prominent disciple. He should have known better. Maybe. Israel, you see, is the name God gives Jacob, great forefather, patriarch Jacob, after as he wrestles all night with God on his way back to see Esau, that brother who so long ago he cheated out of his birthright. And Jacob never gave up wrestling. Never gave up wrestling until morning, when the divine wrestler just leaves. Jacob is victorious, at least in enduring it all. He's a little bit wounded. He can live with that. And the name Israel literally means wrestles with God. They are people who are to wrestle with God, not let go of God, keep holding on to God and wrestling, struggling until something happens and they are free. Peter has forgotten that mark of faith, that his job is to keep wrestling with God until the danger is past. That's what the Canaanite woman has done. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need more hanging on to God and less separating from. Maybe we need to try a little less line drawing between you and me and more wrestling with the God who is in our midst. We need to go through that wrestling most of the time to find guidance and clarity and perseverance and new vision and encouragement. It will take time. And we may be changed. We may be slightly wounded. We may have our opinion changed. We may see something we didn't ever see before. But we need to wrestle with God often enough that we can trust that promise, that God will be merciful to us, will bless us in ways we can't yet expect. Maybe we can find a way to risk trusting that God will really make saving help known among all nations, that God really will judge the peoples with equity and will give us a new vision to see our way through. Maybe we can ask God to carry us through our stormy animosity that we are afraid is going to drown us or send us away to end it. Maybe we can learn to live by faith, letting go of our self-reliance and wrestling with God, simply praying as that Canaanite woman did, Lord, help me. Not, Lord, here's what I think you ought to do, but Lord, help me. Help us. After all, St. Paul says, we have all been disobedient, yet God is merciful to all.